Good morning, everyone. My name is Cindy Webster. Welcome to today's PestFax Insect Identification Training webinar. I am the PestFax newsletter editor and I am hosting behind the scenes today. And this webinar has been funded by the Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development and GRDC as part of the RPM for Grains project. Svetlana Micic is presenting today's webinar. Svetlana is an entomologist based at the DPIRD Albany office.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about the insect pests and natural enemies of pulses. There are quite a few pulses that are grown in our state. We grow chickpeas, fava beans, field peas, lentils, lupins, and I'm going to cover all those. Mung beans are also a pulse, but I won't be covering those because they're not really grown in a great amount in our state. What I am going to cover is the main species that are damaging in spring to pulses. I'll go through their diagnostic features and we'll talk about some of the natural enemies that you might find in the paddocks. And the reason for going through the natural enemies is that we do want you to be able to identify what is a beneficial so that maybe you can target the insecticides to be pest specific. So if you do have natural enemies present, consider maybe using some of the softer chemical options because natural enemies can stop reincursions of pests and can keep pests below damaging levels. Now, in chickpeas, fava beans, field peas, lentils and lupins, from flowering to grain fill, what you can actually see quite easily is that native budworm is present pretty much in all the crops. So we will definitely be covering, I will definitely be covering native budworm. I'll also cover Etiella. This is a sporadic pest. Last time it was a problem in our landscape was about 20 years ago. It very rarely is a problem, but we do want you to be able to identify it. I will go through the different aphid species that we have. What I'm not going to cover are the thrips. They're present in our landscape, extremely rare that they cause any damage. And I will go through the aphid species. Okay, so because some of you went to Dusty's talk and others of you didn't, I'll just very quickly, all of the pest caterpillars that we have in pulses pretty much have an anal proleg, leg at the back, a head, 4 prolegs in the middle, and 6 true legs. There is very little difference in the physical, as in the actual structure of the caterpillar of all the pests. What we need to do to be able to identify the different species, what you're looking at is the colour, you're looking at the hairs on the caterpillar, and you're also looking at the crop that it's in. And this is where it becomes quite important that if you are finding something in the paddock that you're not sure what it is, that you actually take a photograph or you have to take a specimen if you can't take a photograph that shows the specific characters that we need to look at to be able to identify species. Now, the biggest pest of pulses is native budworm. It's the larval stage of these caterpillars that is damaging. The moths fly in and they migrate into our state from the pastoral areas. They're very good at migrating. To date, there is no resistance in native budworm to insecticides. It's the damage that the caterpillars cause pretty much from budding that causes the most yield loss in our pulse crops. But the one distinguishing feature that they have is that the native budworm have black hairs at the head capsule and along their body. They're bumpy with hairs. What you have also is the corneal worm. Now that's really important to distinguish these two species. The corneal worm is not present very often in Western Australia. However, it's resistant to quite a number of insecticides. So you do need to be able to tell the difference between a native budworm and a corneal worm. Now, the other thing that a corneal worm has is a saddle. It's this darkened patch on its body. Some of you may have heard about native budworm being found in cereals. Sometimes it actually hasn't been native budworm. It's been the lesser budworm, which is covered in white hairs. They all look the same. They all have these longitudinal stripes down their bodies. In the majority of cases, for someone like me, it's very difficult to tell the adults apart, to tell the adult, you know, the moths apart from all these different species. But what you're looking for a budworm moth is for it to have this black patch on the hind wing. But really, ultimately, it's the caterpillars that we need you to be able to determine between, because, and this is actually quite important, because we do have fall armyworm in our state. It is now in Geraldton. We expect that fall armyworm will be found in the southern parts. Even though it's a tropical to subtropical pest, it still will have activity throughout our broadacre growing areas. At least that's what the modelling suggests. Now, to be able to tell the fall armyworm apart, what you are really looking for is this inverted V there that you can see. What you are also looking for is the square here on the second last segment, and you're also looking for this trapezoidal shape. And really, we need you to be able to identify those, because it does have the classic white lines, which is distinctive of all armyworm, these white lines on the collar. This particular species is resistant to many insecticides. We actually don't know its resistance profile in our landscapers yet. We also don't know exactly what damage it will do. We expect that it will do similar damage to native budworm. It has got a very wide host range to over 250 plant species, and we expect that it will have a similar host range to native budworm. So we really need you to be able to identify what caterpillars you are finding in the paddock. And this is what the expected host range is based on modelling. So the yellow to the red is its preferred habitat that we expect, but the green is where we expect that this particular species can survive. So you can see it's throughout our broadacre growing areas. The grey is where it's not expected really to thrive. Okay, this is our first poll of the day. Please identify the native budworm in these photos. Is it A, B, C, or D? I think we might close the polls, go with your gut feeling, and we'll see what the answers were. Right, 14% of you got it completely correct. They're all native budworm. And the one thing that you will notice, it is very difficult to tell them apart, because some of them might have been corneal worm. We didn't actually have a very good look in those photos to the actual hairs on the head capsule. This particular species here on the left is a native budworm, but this is one that actually did throw me, because if you actually look at this particular species, you can see there's a bit of a trapezoidal area here. There's a bit of a square happening here, which is indicative of fall armyworm, and it's got a bit of a Y shape. So, but if you compare the two, you can see that this Y on this particular species is actually inverted. But it did really throw me. The agronomist ended up going back to the paddock and couldn't find one with a similar spot pattern, but he did find lots of native budworm. So it's going to be an interesting find now that we've got fall armyworm in Geraldton. But you can see that the native budworm does come in a lot of colours. A lot of them do have this pale white stripe, longitudinal stripe, and lines going along their bodies and the spots, which you can see that the fall armyworm tends to have these distinct white lines. But if you are just finding a single caterpillar in a paddock and you are unsure and you can't see exactly what it is, please take a specimen. See, for instance, this particular species here, you can see it's got some white lines on the collar. They're not distinctive 3 white lines, but there is potential for people to confuse this with fall armyworm. However, if you're unsure, please take a specimen. You can see along the side here that this is from a sweep net sample I took a few years ago, and you can see that native budworm do come in a range of colours, but that longitudinal white line is along its side is very, very obvious. But what we do want you to do is to start looking in crops before damage is expected. Because if you have lots of large caterpillars, usually what happens in, say, for instance, a lupin crop, is that the caterpillars actually pupate before pods form, because they do prefer to feed on the leaves. But if you are monitoring your crop and you see lots of small caterpillars, what this means is they're probably going to be mature at the time of podding. So you possibly will have an issue and you may need to consider spraying. Now, what we do have to assist people with monitoring is there is a trapping program located throughout Western Australia where you can go online and see what the traps are finding in your areas. We had large moth flights quite early on this year. This was taken a week ago. You can see at Geraldton here that there was over 450 moths in a trap, and down towards this way here, you can see there was only 50. However, yesterday, we can see that the numbers over here that were only up to 50 are going close to 100. And we are getting a lot of movement of moths. So really now's the time to start monitoring pulse crops. And while you're monitoring pulse crops, I'll go into how to monitor for them. You may find lucerne seedweb moth. It is an uncommon pest in our landscape. And one of the main reasons it's become uncommon is that we do control weeds quite effectively, especially those that are close to lupin and pulse crops. And that's really been one of the main reasons that we don't have each other at such high numbers, is our good weed control. This particular species does make webbing in the crop, so it's not readily picked up by a sweep net. However, it's so distinctive. It's got this red collar and these red longitudinal lines running down its body. It's very, very distinctive. It's not easily controlled. I'll go through that and that's because when the larvae hatch is that they do burrow into the pods. They form webbing in the pods, and its damage can be confused with native budworm, but native budworm don't form webbing. So if you've got webbing inside a pod, it's Etiella, and it's very difficult to control them once they get in, but it is an extremely rare and minor pest here in WA. The adult moths, I would be very surprised if anyone could identify them in a sweep net. They're very nondescript, but they do have this beak, which basically puts it into the family Pyralidae, because that's what the moths actually have, is a beak. What we do want you to do is when you are starting to monitor pulses is to use a sweep net. Please make sure that you do at least 10 sweeps in different parts of the crop, and the higher the crop is, the more difficult it is to sweep. If you can't get a sweep net through, maybe consider using secateurs to cut 40 plants and bash them into a bucket. 40 plants gives you an idea of what the number of caterpillars are per square metre, and you can figure it out from there what the thresholds are. Now, while you're sweep netting, what you do tend to find is that there are a number of things in the sweep net that are not pests. It's a really good idea to identify them, because the presence of these natural enemies can keep native budworm under threshold levels and also can stop reincursions from occurring. So sometimes what you will find is flies, and we have here a tachinid fly. It's got one pair of wings here, and you can see that it's got these very, very short antennae. Very distinctive of flies, and of this short, stout body. What you may sometimes also find is wasps, and these are distinguished by having you see this area here, it's called a gaster, and it basically attaches the abdomen to the thorax with just a thin line. So if you see any wasps, they're good guys, and many of them are predators. This long thing hanging off the back end is an ovipositor, which it uses to lay eggs into caterpillars, and they usually have very long antennae. Okay, so you can see here, this is the orange caterpillar parasite, very long abdomen, and you can see it's actually laying an egg into a native budworm here. This two-tone parasite that's just parasitizing a pupa by the looks of that. What you sometimes will find in sweep nets or when you're looking in the crop is a caterpillar which has these fuzzy things all over it. They're actually the pupae of the braconid wasp. Very rare that you see the wasp. It's small, very nondescript. And other times what you'll find is a caterpillar with all of these little white things inside it. And basically the wasp lays a single egg, and that egg is actually like twins. It just keeps dividing until it's got quite a few eggs in there, and all those eggs hatch into little grubs, and they basically feed on the caterpillar basically from the inside out, and they pupate inside, and they'll all emerge eventually as little more wasps and come and reinfest other caterpillars that might be present in our landscape. One thing that you might find, and some people get these confused with stink bugs and think that they're a pest, but they're actually a beneficial, is that we've got the glossy shield bug and the spiny shield bug. Now this particular species, if you actually see, it's got a stylet, which means it's a true bug. It's got sucking mouth parts, and that stylet is usually just down on its ventral, on its underside, and it just goes like this pink line all down the underside of the bug. You can see here that the nymphs are very different to the adults, and that's where sometimes people think that they're two different species, but the nymphs don't have wings. The glossy shield bug nymph here is distinguished by these 4 orange dots, and this one here of the spiny shield bug, it's got these lovely circular patch of orange on it, very distinctive. And of course the spiny shield bug, if you actually do look at it, it's actually got these spines coming out of its shoulders. It's very prominent. They're very good predators of caterpillars. By themselves, all of these beneficials don't do much, but together they can actually keep numbers right down. To the next topic, which is aphids. So look, there are 3 main pests of aphids in pulses. The blue-green and the cowpea aphid are the most common in our landscape, and you'll find them over all the pulses. The pea aphid is less common, being found only on field peas and faba beans. However, it's really important that you do be able to tell the difference. And the reason for this is that we want you to be able to find what is present in your paddock and identify it, because we can have incursions happen of pests that we don't expect in our landscape, or we can have some aphid species turn up, and we do want you to be able to identify them. I'll also go through the green peach aphid. This particular aphid species is not a pest in spring. However, if it colonizes plants early at the seedling stage, the plants can struggle simply because of sheer numbers in spring feeding on a single plant, but they're not considered to be a spring pest. Now, some of you went to Dusty's talk, some of you didn't, but for those of you that didn't, the parts of an aphid that we really need you to be able to look at is the funculi. So these are these long extensions coming up from the back end of the aphid. They're also known as cornicles. We need you to look at the legs. We need you to be able to see the legs on the aphid, and also to look at the antennae to determine the length of the antennae. So the most common aphid that we do tend to be coming across in lupin crops especially is the cowpea aphid. It's very shiny and black in colour, and it's got these distinctive white and black legs. The nymphs can sometimes be a bit confusing because they're not that shiny black colour, but they are this dull grey and pretty nondescript, but they do have, if you look really closely, you can actually see that they have black and white legs, and that is distinctive. And it's also very distinctive here in the adults. You can see here the adults have the black and white legs, which is very different from all of our other species that we have in pulses. This is the main identification, is the black and white legs is the cowpea aphid. The other aphid that you do tend to find in pulses is the blue-green aphid. Now, this particular species is readily distinguished from the cowpea, apart from having no black and white legs, is its sifunculi are just so long. They're extremely long, and its antennae extend all the way back along its body. So they've got extremely long antennae and extremely long sifunculi. That is their main distinguishing feature. Otherwise, they're this very nondescript green colour. However, one of our aphids that can be present in the landscape is the pea aphid. It's also, if you can see its name, is Arcociphon pism, which is from the same genus as the blue-green aphid, if you notice that. It's distinguished from the blue-green aphid by these black joints. It's pretty much got black knees, and its antennae have black on the joints of the antennae. So that's its main distinguishing feature, and the fact that it has a limited host range. But what we do want you to distinguish them, all these aphids from, is from the green peach aphid. This particular species, as you're all very well aware of, is resistant to many insecticides. And if you are applying insecticides for the control of any other aphid in the crop and you have green peach aphid present, they will get exposed to the insecticide, and because they develop resistance quite readily, we can have more resistance developing in this particular species. So it's a really good idea to determine whether they are present in the landscape or not, or in your crop. The main way to distinguish the green peach aphid, apart from its ovally type shape, is if you look at the head region right here, you can see that it's got these tubercles that basically lean in. You need a hand lens to be able to see this. It's very, very difficult to see this with the naked eye, but that is the main distinguishing feature for the green peach aphid. It's very difficult to distinguish the adults, seeing a winged aphid with a little black patch here. I can't really tell them apart in the field, the winged aphids, but with a hand lens, you can really see the tubercles, and it's a really good way of identifying what aphid is present in your crop. In lupins and in some of our pulses, the green peach aphid does tend to be found on the underside of leaves. Though sometimes, if numbers are high, you will find them on stems and elsewhere. So just saying that they are found on the underside of the leaf isn't a very good indicator that they are in our landscape, that's a species that's on the underside of leaves, because all of our aphid species can sometimes be found on leaves. The cowpea blue-green tend to be found on the flowering spikes, as does the pea aphid, but still we need you to be able to identify what you're seeing. Okay, this is another poll. What I'd like you all to do is look at this particular species, particularly this particular picture. Okay, you can see it's a lupin crop. There's this round black patch in the middle of this crop. What is the aphid that caused the damage? You have 8 seconds to pick the aphid whose host is lupins and could have caused this damage. Okay, that's good. You've picked the 2 aphid species. So 33% of you picked cowpea, 67% picked good blue-green. as being the one that caused the damage? This is a bit of a trick question, actually. When aphid numbers are high, they secrete a honeydew solution, honeydew sap, and basically sooty mold grows on it. And this is actually what you're seeing. You're seeing sooty mold. Without being able to go and look at the individual plants, it's a bit difficult to tell which aphid species it is. With the cowpea aphid, they are quite black in a crop and they're very easy to see, but it could have just as easily have been blue-green aphid. So you do need to look in more than just a single patch in the crop when you're seeing damage such as this, because what we want you to do is when you're monitoring is to not just look at where the damage is. You need to be looking at in patches of the crop where there is no damage. So what we do want you to do is to go in a W pattern, starting from the crop edge and walking 100 metres in and looking at the flowering spikes in a bit of a W pattern like I've drawn. And the reason for doing that is that you'll get a better idea of what the aphids are rather than just looking at where the aphid hotspots are present in the paddock. And sometimes what you'll find is that it's only on the crop edges and you can get away with just spraying the edges. Now, while you are looking in a crop, you might actually see a number of other different species. So sometimes what you'll see is legless green, they look like little caterpillars, but they've actually got a hook for its mouth part. So if you actually looked very closely, it's got a little bit of a hook for its mouth part. They're actually the larval stage of the hoverfly, and the hoverfly has only one pair of wings, and that distinguishes it from wasps, and it does have this yellow and black patterning, which people sometimes confuse for wasps. But if you actually notice, the antennae here are very, very short. So you've got these very short antennae, which is very different to a wasp. The other thing, if you do look quite closely in paddocks where you do have quite a few aphids, you'll actually see these grubs which are black and yellow. They're the larval stages of ladybirds. Our most common ladybird in our landscape is the transverse ladybird. What you might also see, and this is a blue-green aphid, it's quite large and bloated and a bit white in colour. It's actually been parasitised. If you see quite a few parasitised aphids, the parasitic wasps are present. And if you need to control aphids, maybe consider using a specific insecticide, because if you can keep the aphid predators and parasitoids present in the landscape, they can actually stop aphids from reinfesting a crop and can keep numbers down. Now, one of the other things, this is not seen so often, the adult stages of the lacewings. So you can see here the green lacewing and the brown lacewing. But what we have had some people find is the eggs of the lacewing, and you can tell they're the eggs because they've got this long stem, and at the end of the long stem is this white egg. They're very distinctive. The larval stages are voracious aphid predators. So the brown lacewing, actively feeds on aphids, and the green lacewing larvae has a habit of putting aphid casks on the back of its back as camouflage, and they are quite good to have in our landscape, and with them we can keep aphid numbers right down. But aphids are a big thing in our landscape, and we are having massive issues right now in a number of pulse crops, especially around Hopeton, with aphids. So please make sure you get your identifications correct and make sure that you've actually monitored and are actively looking. This next pest is one that is only specific to peas, and for most of us, look, it's not going to be something that even registers, because peas are a minor crop in our landscape. However, Once it lays eggs, it's too late. So you can see here that this is a yellow egg on the side of a pea. Once the pea weevil lays eggs, it's very difficult to control, because as soon as that egg hatches, the larvae basically bore right into the developing seeds, and this is what you actually end up with, damaged seeds. So what happens is that the larvae, after about 40 days of feeding, what they'll do is they'll make an exit hole. And so you can see this pea here that I'm highlighting in pink has got a bit of a depression. That's the exit hole that the larva has actually made in the pea. And what happens is that some of the pea weevils will hatch and others will actually stay in the, so they'll pupate, and some will actually stay inside the peas as a pupa, as an adult, and hibernate, and others will actually hatch out and go and hibernate. So they will hibernate from 40 days in spring, so over summer, winter, autumn, until the following spring. They do not breed in harvested peas. They will remain dormant. They can be fumigated. If they are present in the paddock, what will happen is that the pea weevils are very good at hiding wherever there's vegetation surrounding paddocks. They'll hide under bark, they'll hide under all sorts of other vegetation, and reinfest the following year's field crop. It's really important that when peas are being grown, that the seed source is clean. And for those of you who've actually taken good notice, you'll actually see that the pea weevil is not a weevil. Technically, it should be called a beetle. You can see doesn't have a snout like a weevil. It's in spring that they become active. So when temperatures get above 20 degrees and you have grown a pea crop, that's when the crop is most at risk. However, it takes 2 weeks from the moment that the females stop hibernating for them to become sexually mature. So that's for their ovaries to develop and for them to feed on pollen. So they're very, very good pollen feeders. And that's why it's important to start monitoring pea crops from flowering. And usually you can get away with just a border spray, because it's the borders of the crop where the infestations occur. However, when you are monitoring for pea weevil, it is a chrysomellid, which basically means, if you actually look at it, it's got these enlarged hind legs, it's got the serrated antennae, but its most distinguishing feature, because if you look very closely at the elytra, which is the casing on the back, you can see it doesn't cover the abdomen all the way through. And it has these black and white striping. That's its most distinguishing feature. If peas haven't been grown in the landscape for many years, it doesn't mean that you don't have pea weevil. Usually they'll infest close to where previous crops have grown, but they can fly in, because it does depend on what's happening in your landscape. So monitor for pea weevil if you are growing peas. Consider not just spraying for them, because just bear in mind that every time an insecticide is applied in a paddock for a pest, other species are getting that same insecticide applied to them. So for instance, red-legged earth mites, and we do have resistance in pests like red-legged earth mites from sprays that were applied to the paddock, and they weren't actually applied for redlegs. So there are a number of information sheets and things like that out there, but I am going to hand over to Cindy now.
I'd just like to mention that DPIRD is planning on trying to run its in-person pest and disease ID training course. The dates are Monday through to Wednesday, the 24th to 26th of August. There's a plant disease identification component and an insect identification component. And it's just an opportunity to get really hands-on learning, looking at samples from the field, looking in the microscope, and of course, all the COVID regulations will be enforced during this training course. But for this course to proceed, we need to know, will there be sufficient numbers for the course to take place? So there is a cost involved, and it's been held at a technology park in Bentley. But if you would like to attend, or if you would like to have any other questions or to talk to someone about this plant disease and insect identification training course, please feel free to contact Jeff Thomas or Dominic Wright on the details below. And we'll also be circulating some more information in the near future. So that is another option for some more training if you'd like to take it up. And that brings us to the very end of our webinar. Dusty has answered a couple of questions behind the scenes. Thank you very much, Dusty. And please don't panic. If you think of a question after this webinar has finished, please feel free to send a question through to the PestFax email address that is on the screen. So thank you all very much for attending today's webinar, and thank you, Svetlana, for presenting to us today. It's been really interesting. We would like to say goodbye for now, and we wish you all a great rest of your day, and goodbye.